weeks off because of cold weather, and then we had some technical difficulties last week with our building flooding, but we are back here to learn more about Jesus' life. Today, we're going to learn 3 areas: home life, getting dressed, and work, what people did for work around Jesus' time. So the word home or house is used a lot in the Bible to describe everything from family homes to compounds to even families like the house of David. But most households in Jesus's time consisted of many generations of a family living together, and there needed to be space for several different kinds of families. Sometimes even poorer families, their animals occupied their home. And these houses had to allow for families to grow and to expand. So let's take a closer look at the materials that were used to build a house during Jesus's time. Houses during Jesus's time in the ancient world were different than we know today. There were many generations of family members living together: grandmas, grandpas, moms, dad, great grandmas and grandpas, cousins. So privacy that we know it today of having our own separate spaces is different. Because of the climate, a lot of life's activities could happen outside on the rooftop or outdoors, and that allowed for more space when you had several families living together. Most families that lived in cities or towns like Palestine didn't have private walled courtyards. Often neighbors shared common outdoor space. Their houses opened up onto small squares where people cooked, hung laundry to dry, visited with each other, did their business, and made their public announcements. This is an example of a wealthier home in the area, probably most likely a well-to-do fishing family. The very rich houses had tile roofs, piped water, under the floor heat, slaves to do their housework, bigger courtyards, and just a little bit more space than the more urban areas that shared outdoor space. Now, this home you can see has a cooking area, a courtyard, upper room, rooftop, and it looks very well constructed with a good balsed stone. Okay, friends, so you can see on our diagram, oftentimes small houses were built into existing caves that were frequent in the area that Jesus lived. The rooms would stay warm in the winter and cold in the summer. Stone was a very common building material. It required a skilled mason to cut stone, so more middle class or upper class families could afford a stonemason. Poorer people just piled uncut rocks onto each other to make a wall. Wood boards were very rare and very valuable. Wealthy people imported cedar from Syria. Sticks and poles were sometimes tied together with rope and stuck together with mud, and that helped keep out the rain and the wind. When stone was scarce or unavailable, people made sun-dried bricks from mud and straw. These walls had to be repaired frequently because they didn't hold up as well to the elements. Tarps and blankets could also be used for shelter. Canopies, tents, they could use them to divide rooms too. Nomads, people who traveled around and didn't have a set house, herded sheep and goats, and they lived in tents made from their animals' wood, wool, and hair. So the tunic was made kind of like a poncho, a hole for the head, and it was usually belted at the waist with leather or linen. The hem of the tunic, so how long it was, usually went to about mid-calf on men and all the way to a woman's ankles. Sometimes working men wore a shorter tunic, and that's just because it was easier for them to work in. During Jesus's time, most Jewish teachers wore head coverings, Other men weren't required to cover their heads, but sometimes they did it to keep off the hot sun. Women had to cover their heads. It wasn't about weather, it was about modesty. Roman women would have worn a veil and a shawl type covering over their hair while in public. Now, their sandals, their footwear, were made of wood or maybe camel and secured to their feet with straps. Jewish women wore longer clothes that covered most of their body, and I know that togas are kind of synonymous with Roman citizens, but only the Romans were allowed to wear togas. People of Jewish faith did not. So fishing was a huge industry during Jesus' time. Fresh fish goes bad pretty fast when you don't have a refrigerator to preserve it. So to make it last, people would preserve the fish in a pickling sauce and send it all over the Roman Empire. Others worked with their hands, tradesmen, builders. They worked with wood and stone to make buildings, furniture, boats, carts. And this is what Jesus' father, Joseph, was described as doing as a carpenter. Most people during Jesus' time were farmers of some sort. Everything was done with human or animal labor. They didn't have plows or anything like that to help them, and they relied on the climate. And since it was a mild climate, they could farm year-round. There was always work to do, planting, weeding, pruning, and harvesting their crops. So I know that you've heard of shepherds in the Bible. There were grazing animals, and this was a common way to make a living in Jesus' time. Sheep, lambs, rams, ewes, these names show up in the Bible. Large flocks could be owned by wealthy families and tended to by shepherds, nomadic families. By the time of Jesus, shepherds were looked down upon. So that's why it's so important that the angel came to a shepherd to tell him first of Jesus' birth. All right, friends, I hope that you had a good time today learning a little bit more about the life of Jesus, that he lived, where he lived, what he wore, what people would have done around him. And we will be back next week to talk more about the life